Imagine this. A nation founded by freed American slaves. Really.
Yeah.
Intended as a black republic, making it the very first republic in West Africa. Pretty surprising, right? A true land of the free, you'd think. Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating, really complex, and honestly often overlooked history of Liberia. It's a story woven from threads of, high idealism, completely unexpected consequences, and these profound struggles for identity, for nationhood.
And what's so fascinating right from the start is how that initial premise, this vision of freedom for African Americans, it almost immediately just ran headlong into these deeply challenging realities and internal contradictions. Our source material, which is a really detailed history of Liberia, it just lays bare these intricate layers.
Yeah, it really does. So our mission today is to explore this incredible journey. We'll trace its, very unusual origins, navigate through periods of internal conflict, external influence, and bring you right up to its current challenges and the remarkable resilience, actually, of its people. You're going to discover how a nation born with this promise of freedom tragically became a land grappling with complex, often painful internal colonization. So let's start at the very beginning then. The idea of repatriating free black people to Africa. It really started gaining momentum in America, by the early 19th century? Why was that happening?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it was seen by some, particularly Northern abolitionists, as maybe the only practical way to overcome the really deep-seated racial prejudice in the U.S. Some felt it was just an impossible situation for black people to truly achieve freedom there. But there was another side, too, a significant fear among white populations, fear of slave revolts, racial violence. So colonization was seen by some as a way to, ensure their own safety and maybe remove free black individuals from American society altogether.
Right. And who was actually, spearheading this massive undertaking?
That would be the American Colonization Society, the ACS, chartered in 1816. And this wasn't some, fringe group. It was founded by a real elite cohort of white Virginians, Pennsylvanians, including really prominent figures like President James Monroe.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. The ACS was the driving force, actively recruiting settlers, arranging payments for land, and they ultimately established the colony of Liberia in 1822.
And what was the vision they painted for these settlers? Our source mentions they were hoping for a warm welcome, but that wasn't quite the reality, was it?
No, indeed. It was far from it. The Americo-Liberians, these roughly 300 freed African Americans who first arrived, they came with a deeply flawed idea. Like the source puts it, they weren't told that Africa was Europe's Negro land. They sort of saw it as this empty, uncivilized place for their ideas, completely ignoring the complex societies already there.
Right, ignoring what was already on the ground.
Exactly. They arrived on shores inhabited by indigenous Africans of a very different disposition. People who didn't adopt European dress or these governmental principles. This was a critical, immediate divergence from their hopeful vision.
So the dream of a black republic, complicated almost instantly by the vibrant reality. Okay, here's where it gets really profound and, frankly, quite heartbreaking. The source describes a two-hump historical narrative of colonization, land dispossession, and oppression. What does that actually mean for the relationship between these Americo-Liberian settlers and the indigenous tribes they met?
It means, tragically, that the Americo-Liberians, who had themselves just escaped this system of profound oppression in America, they became the colonizers.
Wow.
Yeah. The indigenous Africans were dispossessed of their ancestral land. They found themselves living under a system that fundamentally prohibited liberty and justice for anyone whose color was not Americo-Liberian. It's just a stark echo of the very injustice they fled.
So before the Americo-Liberians arrived, how long had people lived in this territory, and how were they organized? What did life look like there?
Well, for over 1,000 years, maybe 1,200 years before the settlers arrived, the area was densely populated. Various indigenous tribes like the Goes, Gola, Crewmen, Bassa, Day, Mandingo, Grebo. And they weren't primitive at all. They had autonomous chiefdoms, established trade networks, sophisticated economies based on things like, palm oil cultivation, fishing, salt production.
Right. So when the Americo-Liberians established their republic in 1847 and modeled it explicitly on the U.S. government, what happened to this long-established indigenous population?
Almost immediately, the Americo-Liberians composed an elite. They just appropriated authority, control, enacting laws to explicitly delineate their power. Things like haircutting and cloth prohibitions, basically enforcing European dress codes and liquor taxes. The indigenous majority, they remained politically and economically disenfranchised. Essentially, second-class citizens in their own land. This is what the source means when it talks about the Americo-Liberian oligarchs later on.
And beyond just imposing these social rules, they fundamentally reshaped the landscape itself, didn't they? Because, as the source points out, the conflict wasn't just white, black, nor Christian pagan. It was really deeply rooted in land ownership.
Precisely, yeah. The Americo-Liberians reserved huge tracts of land for themselves, systematically dispossessing the native inhabitants. They either misunderstood or maybe deliberately disregarded the unwritten Afro-Liberian land tenure systems. Instead, they used Western contracts to seize large regional lands.
Okay.
And this created a profound territorial division. You had Americo-Liberian hegemony in the coastal regions, and then indigenous tribes often fighting back from the resource-rich interior.
It just sounds like a deeply structurally unequal society from the absolute moment of its inception.
It was. Only Americo-Liberians were legally entitled to be citizens. Indigenous tribes faced this long, arduous process to naturalize. Individual chiefs could become citizens, but only by obeying the laws and, as the source phrases it, comporting themselves as became citizens, which basically meant adopting Americo-Liberian customs and ways of life.
Wow, right.
And by 1950, just to put this in perspective, only about 68,000 of Liberia's 735,000 people were Americo-Liberians, a tiny fraction.
And the source points out this stunning irony in the choice of Liberia's site for colonization, specifically because of its indigenous population. They were viewed as, quote, inferior in almost every respect, even barbaric fetish-worshipping pagans, and by some missionaries in Monrovia as nothing more than the primates of the forest. Given all of this, what does this internal dynamic really mean for the whole concept of freedom in Liberia?
Well, it leads to this fundamental, really tragic insight that freedom without compromise has its price. The source makes it clear. The greatest ongoing challenge for Liberia has been national identity. The socio-political conflicts weren't just about power, they were fundamentally socio-cultural. A struggle against a monocultural social order, one that demanded this delicate balance between national unity and cultural diversity. And the tragedy is that the two contending ethnic groups, they just became too dominant, too entrenched to yield ground for true reconciliation for far too long.
So with this really unique and often fraught social structure in place, the question then turns to how this new republic was designed to govern itself, especially its economic future. Let's talk about how this new republic was structured. You mentioned it was modeled on the U.S. Constitution, but what did that look like in practice for Liberia?
The government did indeed have three branches. Executive, legislative, that consisted of a Senate, 2 members from each of the 3 counties, and a House of Representatives with 5 from each county, and judicial. The president was directly elected for a 4-year term.
Okay. And who was actually allowed to vote or hold office in this new system?
Well, the right to vote was strictly limited. Males aged 21 and up, and crucially, they had to be free and possess property.
Ah, the property requirement.
Exactly. This quite intentionally reinforced an oligarchy where, as the source states, wealth and property were to be the securing conditions of freedom and privilege. It basically enshrined power in the hands of the land-owning elite.
Right. Okay, shifting to the economy. What were Liberia's early economic prospects like in the 19th century? Did it have resources?
There were a couple of significant developments. First, the codification of international law did allow Liberia to secure some small loans, but honestly, no major development projects ever really materialized from them. More promisingly, perhaps, large reserves of iron ore, limestone, and rubber were discovered in the late 1880s. But their real economic impact only began to be felt, after the turn of the 20th century.
So even with these apparent resources, it still sounds like Liberia struggled economically right from the outset. What was holding it back?
It absolutely did struggle. To illustrate, Nigeria, for instance, received large bond issuances for critical infrastructure, like railroad construction in the late 1890s. Liberia was only permitted to issue this tiny 15,000 gold franc bond.
15,000?
Yeah. The source notes it was effectively struck at zero, meaning it generated almost no capital. And as a result, no substantial projects were undertaken. By 1979, the country was explicitly described as an economic failure, largely due to these really antiquated economic policies and just a persistent lack of aggressive reform measures.
What about its cultural heritage? With all these deeply distinct groups living together, did a unique Liberian identity start to emerge despite all the divisions?
Yes, actually, a melting pot of cultures, values, customs from the Americo-Liberians and the native Africans did result in what the source describes as the rapid production of a vibrant national and cultural identity. However, and it's a big however. This nascent identity was just continuously undermined by the political segregation and the Americo-Liberians' really entrenched racial outlook on society. These became continuous impediments to genuine national unity.
And this deep-seated internal tension, it seems inevitable, looking back, that it led to this period of devastating civil unrest and war. What finally sparked those massive conflicts?
Well, dissatisfaction had been mounting for decades, really, in the Liberian hinterland. From the 1960s into the 70s, President William R. Tolbert, he did try to introduce some reforms aimed at improving indigenous living standards. But these weren't fully supported and, critically, weren't taken seriously by the U.S. government at the time. Add to that budgetary shortages, rampant corruption. It created a highly volatile atmosphere.
And how did the population, especially the younger generation, how did they respond to this growing frustration?
The young, educated indigenous elite in particular were deeply frustrated. They felt completely ignored in the political process, largely unable to find jobs. Then, tame protest riots, as the source calls them, erupted in December 1979. They were met with a really violent reaction, led to over 40 deaths, and forced many educated youth to just flee the country.
So that created the conditions.
Exactly. Those events created the precise conditions for a coup.
And this is when Samuel K. Doe burst onto the scene, right? Fundamentally changing Liberia's trajectory. What happened there?
Precisely. In 1980, indigenous captain Samuel K. Doe, he was from the National Port Authority, along with his men, successfully seized control. Their stated goal was to overthrow the Americo-Liberian oligarchs who'd ruled for so long. However, their actions also, according to our source, effectively destroyed the Liberian economy.
And that coup just plunged the nation into years and years of devastating civil war. What was that experience like for the people caught in the middle of it?
Well, from 1989 to 1997, you had a full-scale civil war erupt, primarily led by Charles Taylor's National Patriotic Front of Liberia, the NPFL. And the brutality was just horrific. Paramilitary troops attacking civilians indiscriminately, engaging in, the reports mentioned sodomy, torture, even cannibalism.
Unbelievable.
It led to this mass exodus of civilians, emptying cities, creating vast refugee camps all across West Africa. It was just a prolonged nightmare for ordinary people.
And what's particularly striking, looking at the sources, is that despite numerous peace efforts, international intervention, the fighting just seemed to keep reigniting, like a brutal cycle. What explains that?
It's true. International efforts, things like the Banjul Conference in 1990, they often fail to bring lasting peace because, well, the underlying issues weren't really resolved, and key players often just didn't adhere to the agreements they'd signed. Even after Charles Taylor was elected president in 97, following his victorious march into Monrovia, the country immediately fell back into disorder, rampant looting, killings.
So no real stability.
None. Fighting continued in various forms right up until 2003, constantly fueled by the flow of weapons, drugs. The Accra Peace Agreement in 1995, for instance, that proved really problematic. Rebels just stole weapons, and the country descended into what the source calls almost total lawlessness once again.
And the human cost must have been devastating, especially for essential services like, say, health and education.
Oh, absolutely catastrophic. The 15-year conflict severely disrupted both. It dismantled much of the infrastructure, 2/3 of classrooms, destroyed or repurposed as barracks. 2/3 of teachers simply abandoned the system.
Wow.
Public health budgets just plummeted to a mere 0.5% of the national budget, causing a widespread collapse of services. To put it in perspective, Liberia ended up with only about 4,000 health workers. The recommended number was around 13,000.
Huge gap.
Massive. And enrollment in schools in 2004, that's a year after the fighting mostly stopped, was estimated at only 25% of what it was before the conflict. The long-term impact is still being felt today, profoundly.
So, after all that turmoil, with the source describing it as an economic failure and an ethnic mess after decades of conflict, where does Liberia stand today? What's the path forward look like?
It's true that Liberia faces these immense inherited challenges. It's a nation still trying to rise from the ashes of these deep historical wounds and the very recent conflicts. While it's incredibly rich in resources timber, or its economic policies have historically been, well, antiquated. But the long-term vision, as outlined in our source, is to fundamentally escape this poverty trap.
What about environmental issues? Is that something Liberia is managing to prioritize in its recovery efforts?
Historically, environmental considerations have hardly been a a basis for Liberia's national policy.
Yeah.
And the consequences now are quite dire. You've got land-based pollution, raw sewage, widespread garbage problems. These are significant issues contributing to diseases like cholera. The source speaks of a total neglect of concern about the state of the environment, which it actually links directly to the historical suppression of democratic opinions. So immediate, comprehensive conservation plans are critically needed to address this neglect.
Okay. The source also highlights women's rights and gender issues, noting Ellen Johnson Sirleaf as Africa's first female president, which was, of course, a landmark achievement. But what are the persistent challenges for women in Liberia today?
Yes, President Sirleaf definitely championed women's rights. She created a gender ministry, strengthened the sexual violence bill, huge steps. However, significant challenges do persist. Women still struggle particularly with access to land and security of tenure.
Why is that?
It's largely due to Liberia's patrilineal culture, where land often passes through male lines, and also the ineffectiveness, often, of customary courts when it comes to marital property. This sadly leaves many women vulnerable to land grabbing and just general insecurity.
Right. And what about the youth? The source suggests they represent this truly vibrant source of creative energy, maybe a key to the future.
Absolutely. Liberia has a massive youth bulge, approximately 43, almost 44% of the population under 15, and something like 66 to 82% under 25.
That's huge.
It's huge. And this generation is seen as pivotal for securing lasting peace, building resilience, driving future development. They are, as the source says, socially mobile, technologically proficient, and crucially, they can readily see the price of war, having lived through its aftermath or grown up in its shadow. Their potential is just immense.
So what does this all mean then for Liberia's journey? Towards stability, towards prosperity, it has these abundant natural resources, such a diversity of peoples.
Well, a crucial question really emerges here, doesn't it? How can a nation like Liberia truly leverage its wealth, both human and natural, to achieve stability and prosperity, given its unique foundational conflicts? The source really emphasizes that compliance with fundamental global standards of governance, a responsible society, prudent management of the asset base, nonviolence and honesty, these are absolutely paramount if it's going to overcome its deep socioeconomic challenges.
And the conclusion in our source. It suggests that without a complete examination, maybe even a reconstruction of its foundational doctrines, Liberia risks remaining trapped in a cycle of aid dependency, even with all its wealth of human and natural resources.
Precisely. It points directly to, quote, entrenched political, economic, and social disparity, aggravated by the unequal competition for power and control of the state by the indigenous and settler people. The pursuit of social justice for all Liberians, while maybe appearing unrealistic but impossible, it might only be achievable through really fundamental changes. Perhaps even, the source suggests, a revival of something like the Grand Coalition Act of 1862, which was an early attempt to bridge some of these divides.
What an incredible deep dive. Liberia's layered, complex history. It's just striking. We've seen a nation born of really the noblest intentions for freedom, yet almost immediately grappling with these profound complexities of internal colonization, identity conflicts, brutal civil wars. It's just such a powerful story of paradox. Yeah, the resilience of its people and the undeniable potential of its youth, those things are clear. But so too are the deep-seated challenges stemming from its unique origins and this persistent struggle for true equality, for shared prosperity for every single citizen. So what does this all mean for you listening? Liberia's story offers a potent, maybe timeless lesson that freedom, when it's selectively applied, when it's not extended equally to all within a society, it can inadvertently sow the very seeds of future conflict and instability. As you reflect on Liberia's remarkable journey from this promised land of the free to a nation still striving, really striving for internal unity, maybe consider this. How do societies truly reconcile their foundational ideals with historical injustices to build a truly inclusive and therefore truly free future for all their citizens?